Montana Territory, June 1878. The sun was barely up when Josephine Darden stepped off the eastbound freight wagon just outside of Big Timber, her boots hitting the dusty ground like she had not just run from everything she once knew. Her dress was plain, dusty from the road, and her hands shook just enough to betray what she was trying to hide: fear, and something sharper beneath it. She had nothing but a canvas satchel and a stitched-together past she had no intention of ever speaking of again. She kept moving. The town hadn't woken yet, save for a few wood smoke trails curling up from chimneys. Her eyes scanned the road, then the hills beyond. She had no plan, only forward. Always forward. Behind her, the past still breathed. She had left Colorado Springs 3 nights ago, left behind the sound of slamming fists, her father's debts, and the man who thought her silence was something he could own. She had almost stayed for her boys, but they were already gone. 2 sons, taken from her by her husband's family in court, like she was nothing more than a broken dish they could sweep away. She had not even been allowed to say goodbye. Josephine kept walking until the land opened wide, a stretch of grass and wildflowers reaching toward the mountains, and then she stopped, finally letting herself breathe. "You lost." The voice came from behind her, calm, low, and laced with curiosity. She turned and found a man on horseback. He looked about 30, maybe older, with broad shoulders and sun-touched skin. His hat was pushed back slightly, showing dark blonde hair and eyes the color of rain. He was not smiling, but he did not look unkind. "No," Josephine said, steadying her voice. "Just passing through." "Not much past this," he said, glancing at the road behind her. "You got somewhere to be?" She lifted her chin. "I do not owe you my story." He nodded once, not offended. "Name's Osric Tannin. I work cattle out past the ridge." Josephine's eyes narrowed. "You always stop and question strangers?" "Only the ones walking alone before breakfast." Her lip twitched, almost a smile. "Josephine Darden." He dismounted, slow and easy. "You look like you need coffee more than distance." She hesitated, but her feet ached and she had not eaten since yesterday. "I have nothing to trade." "Not offering charity," he said. "Offering coffee." He led her toward a small fire tucked behind a line of cottonwoods where a pot sat warming. There was a bedroll, a saddle, and a pack mule tied nearby. She realized he was camped here alone. "You live out here?" "Sometimes," Osric said. "Depends on the cattle." They sat across from each other near the fire. He poured her a tin cup of coffee and passed over a crust of bread and dried apple slices. She ate in silence, eyes on him as much as the food. He did not press her, did not ask where she was from or where she was going. He just sat there, arms resting on his knees, watching the fire. "You always this quiet?" she asked after a while. He shrugged. "You already said you did not owe me your story." Seemed fair. She looked down at her cup. "You ever been so tired you forget your own name?" "Yeah," he said. "I have." Josephine blinked. It was not the answer she expected. They sat like that until the sun rose higher. The warmth settled on her shoulders, and for the first time in days, she felt something that almost touched safety. Not peace, but the idea of it. When she stood to leave, he stood too. "You heading anywhere in particular?" "No." "You got anyone looking for you?" She paused. "They are not looking to help." He nodded again as if he understood. "Then maybe you stay for a while. Help me with the herd. Trails are long, and you seem like someone who knows how to keep moving." Josephine stared at him. He was not asking anything of her. Not her story, not her past. Just whether she wanted a place to stand for a little while. She swallowed hard. "I can ride." He smiled for the first time, small but honest. "Then you will fit fine." They rode out that afternoon, just the two of them and the wind, heading west with the sun warm on their backs. Josephine kept her eyes on the horizon, but every now and then, she glanced sideways at the man beside her. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she was no longer running alone. They drove the cattle slow through the northern stretch of the Boulder River Valley, where hawks rode the sky and the grass bent with a whisper you could almost understand if you listened long enough. Josephine rode the bay mare Osric lent her, a quiet-eyed animal with patience in her steps. The herd moved steady, their hooves stirring up the scent of crushed sage. By the second day, her muscles ached in places she didn't know she had, but she didn't complain. Osric noticed anyway. "Left knee bothering you?" he asked, still watching the trail ahead. She shifted in the saddle. "You always this sharp-eyed? You favor it on downslopes," he said, adjusting the brim of his hat. "It's a habit I pick up from lame calves." Josephine snorted. Charming. That evening, they made camp by a creek where the water moved slow and cold. Osric set about building a small fire while she gathered what she could find for kindling, mostly dry pine needles and wind-broken limbs. She handed him the bundle, their fingers brushing for barely a second. "You don't ask many questions," she said. "That bother you?" "No," she said, sitting on the ground across from him. "Just not used to it." He didn't answer right away. The fire caught, flickering low and orange. He added a few flat stones near the edge to warm for later. "Folks carry more than they say," he said finally. "Doesn't mean I need to hear it out loud." Josephine watched the flames. "I buried my mother when I was 17. She was the only one who ever looked at me like I wasn't a problem to solve." Osric didn't look away. "What happened to her?" "Typhoid. Took her in 2 weeks. After that, I stopped believing things could change." He nodded once. "Sounds like you kept going anyway." "I didn't have a choice." The fire cracked, sending up a burst of sparks that drifted toward the darkening sky. She reached for her satchel and pulled out a length of mending she'd started days ago. The thread was coarse, and the fabric had seen better years, but she sewed with practiced hands. Osric leaned back against a fallen log. "You sew for work?" "I used to," she said. "Took in repairs for the boarding house in town. Paid enough to keep me fed." "You ever think on settling again? Somewhere small, maybe quieter?" She looked up, needle paused in the air. "I think about it more than I admit." He didn't speak again until her stitching was done and the fire had burned down to embers. She lay on her side, wrapped in a blanket he'd lent her, the stars thick above them. "You're not a problem, Josephine," he said quietly. "Not to me." She didn't answer, but she didn't turn away either. The next morning, fog hung low over the valley, and the cattle moved slower through the damp. Osric rode ahead, checking the line. She followed at her own pace, the mare picking her way through the uneven ground. They passed a thicket of chokecherry bushes, and Josephine slowed to glance at them. "Those ripen late," Osric called back. "You always this full of wisdom?" He gave her a look over his shoulder. "Only when someone's about to poison themselves." They crossed paths with another rider come down from the high basin, an old man with a red scarf tucked under his collar and a rifle strapped to his saddle. He greeted Osric by name and eyed Josephine with open curiosity. "This your new hand?" he asked. "She's helping a spell," Osric said. "Josephine, this is Rule Tate. He keeps to the high meadows." Rule tipped his hat. "You from these parts?" "I'm just passing through," she said. He studied her for a moment. "You look like someone who knows how to keep their own." "I do." Rule nodded and turned to Osric. "Heard there's been wolf sign near Dry Creek. Might want to double-check your fence lines." Osric thanked him and the man rode on. They moved on too, quieter now. Josephine glanced over. "You trust him?" "Rule's got a long memory and a short temper, but he's never lied to me." They reached the southern edge of the pasture by late afternoon. Osric swung down and opened the gate, letting the cattle through one by one. Josephine rode up beside him. "You always this careful with everything? I've lost too much not to be." That night, she sat with her back to a cottonwood trunk, watching him as he brushed down his horse. He moved with a kind of patience she wasn't used to, a man who didn't fill silence with noise or movement with hurry. "You ever stop, Osric?" she asked. He turned, brush still in hand. "You mean quit?" "I mean rest." He shook his head. "Not yet." She stood slowly, brushing dust from her skirt. "Maybe you should learn." He met her gaze. "You think you could teach me?" "I might." He smiled just a little. But it wasn't a smile meant to charm. It was something simpler, an answer, maybe, or an invitation. They didn't speak again as the sky deepened to indigo. But when she lay down that night, her bedroll felt warmer than it had before. Not from the fire, but from something she hadn't let herself believe in years. Someone walking beside her, not behind, not ahead, beside. The rains came 2 days later, not hard, but steady, the kind that soaked slow and clung to the earth like it meant to stay. Osric led the herd to higher ground, where the slope drained clean and the grass held firm. Josephine rode beside him, her coat drawn close, collar damp where the water had crept in. She didn't complain, but her hands were raw from rope and weather, and her eyes carried the weight of someone who had never been offered rest for free. By dusk, the cattle were settled in a tight basin ringed by cottonwoods. Osric gave a low whistle, and the dog, a wiry blue heeler Josephine hadn't seen before, emerged from the trees and circled the herd with practiced ease. "I didn't know you had a dog," she said, stepping down from the mare. "He sticks close to the hills most days," Osric replied. "Comes when it matters." She watched the animal weave through the herd, then sit beneath the nearest tree like he'd always belonged there. "What's his name?" "Bran." She crouched beside him, holding out a hand. Bran sniffed once and laid his head against her knee. "He doesn't take to most folks," Osric said, surprised. "Animals don't lie," she murmured. Osric didn't press further. He moved to build a lean-to beneath a stand of pines while she gathered dry moss from under the rocks for kindling. The rain had softened the world, made every sound feel closer. When the fire caught, she sat beside it, boots steaming, eyes half closed. "Where'd you learn cattle?" she asked, voice low. "My father ran a spread near Miles City," he answered. "Didn't leave much standing when he died, but I learned what I could." "You were close." Osric shook his head. "He taught with his fists more than words. Left me the land and a ledger full of debts. Took years to clear it." She didn't offer sympathy. He hadn't asked for it. Instead, she drew her knees up and rested her chin on them. "I used to believe if I was good enough, they'd let me stay," she said quietly. "My husband's family. I thought if I scrubbed their floors, if I kept silent long enough, they'd see I was worth keeping near the boys." Osric didn't speak until the wind shifted and the smoke drifted sideways. His voice was steady when he asked, "They ever tell you weren't?" "They didn't need to." He reached behind him and pulled a wool blanket from his pack, handing it over without a word. She took it, fingers brushing his for a second before she settled it across her lap. "Do you think people can start over?" she asked. "I think most folks don't know how," he said. "But I think it's possible." She looked at him then, long and quiet, as if measuring the truth of him against the firelight. He didn't turn away. Later, when the fire burned low and the rain softened to mist, she lay beneath the lean-to beside her saddlebag. Bran curled at her feet. Osric sat nearby, sharpening a blade against a stone. The rhythmic scrape filled the space between them. "Will you stay out here when the season turns?" she asked without opening her eyes. Not for winter, he said. I've got a cabin up near the Stillwater Fork. Small, but it holds heat. She opened her eyes. That where you go when you stop moving? He paused, meeting her gaze across the shadows. That's where I rest. She rolled onto her side, watching him. You ever think about something more permanent? You mean someone? He asked. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. He set the whetstone down. I don't want quiet if it's built on pretending. I've had enough of that kind of silence. Josephine's voice was soft, but firm. I don't know how to be anything but what I am now. Then don't be anything else. The fire crackled once, a single pop that faded into the night. She pulled the blanket higher. I'd like to see that cabin. Osric gave a small nod, one she could feel without seeing. Then I'll take you there. Sleep came slow, but when it did, it came without dreams. And for the first time in years, she didn't wake with her heart racing. Morning came with a pale sky, the kind that promised clearer days. The herd stirred, lowing softly. Bran nudged her hand with a cold nose, and she sat up, brushing pine needles from her hair. Osric was already saddling the horses, moving with the ease of someone who knew what the day would ask of him. She stood, stretched, and walked over. I'll ride flank today, she said. He looked at her, a slow understanding passing from him to her like something earned, not given. Good, he said. I was hoping you would. By the middle of July, the grass had turned stiff with heat, and the air held that stillness that warned a storm was building somewhere beyond the mountains, just waiting. Osric led the herd westward, weaving them through a dry gulch where the rocks held pockets of shade. Josephine rode close behind, keeping the stragglers tight, her shirt stuck to her back and the sun pressing hard against her neck. They didn't speak much that morning. The work asked for attention, and both of them had long since learned that quiet could be more honest than words. When they reached a rise overlooking a long stretch of cotton fields gone wild with thistle, Osric pulled his horse to a stop. That's the halfway mark, he said, tipping his hat back. From here, we follow the creek until the high pasture opens up. Josephine squinted into the light. How much land do you run? Not all of it's mine. I lease a few parcels from a widow named Tamsin. She was kind to me when I didn't have much to offer but work. I'd like to meet her. You will. They moved on, the horses picking their way through rock and brush until the sound of water reached them. The creek ran shallow, but fast, and Osric led the herd across with practiced ease. Josephine waited until the last calf stepped clear of the current before nudging her mare in behind. On the other side, they found an open stretch of grass sheltered by a stand of aspens. Osric dismounted and loosened his saddle straps. Josephine followed suit, her hands moving slower than usual. The sun had taken more out of her than she'd realized. You're favoring your left arm, he said, not looking at her directly. Caught it on the corral post yesterday. It's fine. Let me see. She hesitated, then rolled up her sleeve. A long bruise ran from just below her shoulder to the edge of her elbow, darkened now to a deep plum. You should have said something. I've had worse. He didn't touch her, just looked. That doesn't mean you should keep quiet about it. She rolled her sleeve back down. I'm not used to someone asking. You'll get used to me. Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. I'm not sure I know how. I'm not in a hurry. That night they camped by a bend in the creek where the stones were flat and warm from the day's heat. Josephine laid out her blanket while Osric prepared a pan of beans over the fire. The smell drifted up with the smoke. She sat cross-legged, twirling a piece of dry grass between her fingers. Did you ever think about marrying? She asked. Once. Her name was Lorna. She didn't care for the land, though. Said it was too lonely. And now, I stopped letting myself picture it. Josephine nodded slowly. I thought I was a wife once, but I was more of an obligation than someone to be chosen. You're not that to me. She looked at him, her face unreadable in the firelight. I need to be sure. I'll wait. They ate in silence, the fire popping softly between them. Afterward, Osric pulled his coat tighter and leaned back against the saddle propped behind him. Josephine lay down beside her pack, staring up at the stars just beginning to show. Osric, she said quietly. Yeah, if I stay, I don't want to be taken care of. I want to build something. I wouldn't want it any other way. She turned her head toward him. You really think someone like me can start again? I don't think you ever stopped. You just hadn't found the right ground. She closed her eyes. Maybe this is it. Neither of them said more after that. The night deepened, cool and still, and the wind carried the scent of pine. Somewhere nearby, Bran shifted against a hollow log, keeping watch. Josephine didn't dream of the past that night. She didn't dream at all. By the time they reached Osric's cabin, the sky had begun to cool with the coming of August, the days shorter at the edges, and the wind carrying a hint of dry pine and river stone. The cabin stood plain but firm at the edge of a clearing, built of thick-hewn logs and a stone chimney that reached up like a promise. Josephine studied it from the saddle, one hand resting lightly on her thigh. It looks like it's been here a while, she said. My father built it when I was a boy, Osric replied, swinging down from his horse. I rebuilt the walls 3 winters ago, kept his shape, but made it mine. Josephine dismounted, her boots crunching against the packed earth. She walked the perimeter slow, eyes catching on the stacked wood, a small shed beside the cabin, and the fenced garden beyond it, where the last of the summer squash clung to brittle vines. Inside, the air was cool and quiet. A wood table sat near the window, worn smooth at the edges. A rifle hung above the hearth. There were no curtains, only rough linen tacked over the panes. She ran her hand along the edge of the table, then turned to face him. Where do you keep the kettle? She asked. He pointed to a shelf by the stove. Second hook. She set about building the fire while he unpacked the last of their supplies. When the coffee boiled, they sat across from one another, and the space between them felt different than it had in the open. Closer, realer. You mean to stay? He asked, his voice low but without hesitation. Josephine wrapped both hands around the tin cup. I do. But I need more than a roof. He leaned forward. Tell me. I want to plant roots. I want to mend more than shirts. I want to wake up in a place where I don't have to watch the door. His fingers curled around the edge of the table. You'd have all that here, with me. I won't be owned again, she said softly. You won't be, he said. Not ever. A silence passed between them, heavy with understanding. Then she stood, crossed the room, and rested her palm against his chest. His hand came up, covering hers. Neither moved for a long moment. That night, she slept inside while the wind pressed against the eaves. Her bed was narrow, the quilt lumpy, but she slept through until morning, and when she woke, he was already at the stove, frying cornmeal cakes. You cook? She said, tying her hair back with a strip of cloth. I eat better when I do. She joined him at the table, and they ate without much talk. After, she walked out to the garden and knelt among the faded stalks. By mid-morning, she cleared 2 rows and gathered enough beans to fill a small sack. She found Osric in the shed, oiling the harness leather. We need a root cellar, she said. He looked up. I can dig one. I'll help, she said. I know how to keep stores from spoiling. He nodded, then handed her a cloth to clean her hands. You want to keep chickens? I do. I'll build the coop. They worked side by side in the days that followed, neither one needing to fill the hours with more than what mattered. She stitched curtains from goat wool Osric had stored in a chest. He patched the roof before the first hard rain hit. At night, she read aloud by lamplight from the only book left in the cabin, a dog-eared volume of Psalms Osric's mother had once owned. One evening, as the sun faded behind the ridge and the wind rose sharp with the coming cold, Josephine stood by the doorway with her arms crossed, watching the trees bend. Osric stepped behind her, resting his hand on her shoulder. "You're not looking back anymore," he said. "I don't have to." He turned her gently until she faced him. "Will you marry me, Josie?" She stepped closer, reaching to take his hand. "Yes, I will." They married 6 days later, quiet and without fuss. Tamsin, the widow who had leased Osric the southern pasture, brought a fresh-baked corn pie and stood witness alongside her grandson. The preacher rode up from Absorki on a red mule, quoted no more than he needed, and left before supper. Josephine wore a dress she dyed herself with walnut hulls, the brown soft and even. Osric shaved for the first time in months and wore a clean shirt she'd stitched a new cuff onto. They said their vows beneath the aspens behind the cabin, where the wind sang low through the leaves and Bran lay at their feet like he understood. Afterward, they shared stew and bread with Tamsin and the preacher, and when the sun dipped low, Osric and Josephine stood alone again beneath the trees. "You're not afraid?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I was for a long time, but not with you." He kissed her then, slow and sure, and the world stilled around them. The weeks turned, and the first snow came early. They stored apples in the root cellar, canned beans, and salted meat. Josephine covered the windows with wool to keep in the heat and taught Osric how to stitch the torn lining of his coat. At night, they lay together beneath the thick quilt she'd sewn from scraps, her head resting against his chest, his hand on her back. By spring, the garden bloomed in green shoots, and 4 hens pecked around the coop. Josephine built a small table beside the window and began taking in mending from nearby farms. Osric added another pasture fence, and when the calves dropped, they named one after Tamsin's grandson. One evening, Josephine stood barefoot on the warm porch boards, arms folded across her belly. Osric came beside her, tucking his arm around her. "Next winter, there'll be 3 of us here," she said. He kissed her temple. "There'll be room." And there was. They built a life slow, honest, and without illusion. Not perfect, but rooted. She laughed more. He spoke more. And with every passing season, the silence between them changed shape, not the edge of fear, but the depth of knowing. They grew old together in that cabin where the wind met the trees and the creek ran clear, and neither of them ever had to run again.